wow, when I see this many sources about social justice, it really hits me. This isn't just like skimming the headlines anymore.
Yeah.
We're really trying to get deep into this.
Absolutely, and it's one of those things you really have to go beyond the surface level, you know? One thing I think is really interesting about these sources is how they connect the historical context with what's going on right now.
Right.
And this idea of inclusive freedom.
You know, that phrase, inclusive freedom, that's something that really stuck out to me, too. It's like, we can talk about freedom and having rights, but if it doesn't apply to everyone, then what's the point, really?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? And a lot of these sources say that, you know, real freedom that means something, freedom that can last, it can only happen if everyone has it. And that's where things get interesting and really tough, because if you look back at the history and what's happening now with social justice in America, you see that a lot of times people haven't had that inclusive freedom.
Right. It's like we're all shown this perfect picture of freedom, but then for a lot of people, that picture, it's got all these like hidden barriers, these injustices that cover it up.
Exactly. And those barriers, they show up everywhere. For example, the racial wealth gap. That's something that a few of these sources really get into, white privilege especially. And I think you had some thoughts on those statistics, didn't you?
Yeah. It's one thing to know that there's a wealth gap out there, but then when you see the actual numbers, that like white households have way more wealth on average than Black and Latinx households, I mean, that really shows you how bad the problem is.
Absolutely. And the source is saying that it's not just about the choices people make or things that happen by chance. It's saying that this gap is a direct result of things that have happened in the past and systems that have been holding people of color back for generations.
And we're not just talking about things that happened a long time ago, right?
Oh.
Equality for all draws a connection between those historical practices and things that are still going on today.
Exactly. We can see a straight line from things like redlining, where they literally drew lines on a map saying, we're not giving loans in these Black neighborhoods, we're not giving services, to the issues those same communities are dealing with right now. Things like not having good schools, healthcare that's not as good, and poverty that's like a cycle it's so hard to break out of.
Right. It's like all those unfair practices from the past just keep building on each other. And it creates this huge wealth gap that just keeps affecting people generation after generation.
That's right. And it's not just about money. These practices have also caused a lot of segregation, people being kept apart, you know, in where they live, but also in a social way. So these communities of color, they're more isolated, they have fewer opportunities. And speaking of being left out and isolated, you said the stuff in the rebranding of hate was kind of scary.
Yeah, that one really, I don't know, it's kind of creepy, to be honest. Like, it's really disturbing to see how these white nationalist groups are using code words and the internet to get their message out there. They're making it sound less extreme, so regular people might not realize what they're really all about.
It's like they're trying to make hate part of the mainstream. They're trying to make it seem less extreme and more acceptable, especially to people who might be feeling lost or like no one's listening to them. They use those feelings, you know, that disillusionment, and they offer this distorted sense of belonging. But underneath it all, it's still a dangerous message based on prejudice and discrimination.
And what's scary is how well it's working, especially online. Misinformation spreads so fast. It's like they're using people's fears, their anxieties against them, offering simple solutions to complicated problems.
Yeah, and a lot of times those simple answers end up hurting the very people who are already being targeted with hate, like trying to stop them from voting. What protecting the right to vote talks about in terms of history is, well, it's really something.
It really is. Like the things they did back during the Jim Crow era to stop Black Americans from voting, it's just unbelievable. Poll taxes, tests to see if you could read, saying you can only vote if your grandpa could vote. It was like they were attacking their basic rights from every angle. And the sad thing is, some of those tactics, they're still being used now. They've just been disguised.
That's right. We've still got voter ID laws that make it harder for minorities to vote, gerrymandering to weaken their voting power, and just generally making it more difficult to register to vote or even to cast a ballot.
It's like they're trying to silence the people who've historically had the least amount of power, preventing them from having a say in the systems that actually directly affect their lives.
Yeah.
This isn't just history. It's about the core of our democracy.
And it shows how connected all these different issues really are. The fight for racial justice, for economic fairness, for the right, they're all woven together. They're like different parts of the same big social justice tapestry.
Yeah. And just like racial justice and voting rights are tied together, so is the struggle for LGBTQ equality, like what we read in the LGBTQ rights source.
Absolutely. And that source does a good job of digging up some parts of LGBTQ history in America that people might not know about, like that lavender scare you mentioned before. During the Cold War, they were purging LGBTQ folks from government jobs, labeling them as security risks, all because of who they loved. It's a scary reminder of how deep this prejudice and discrimination runs.
It's like they thought just being LGBTQ was a threat to the entire country. It makes no sense. And it's not like attitudes magically changed overnight either. The fight for LGBTQ rights, it's far from over.
You're right, and that source, it talks about the challenges that the LGBTQ community still faces. Discrimination when it comes to housing, healthcare, jobs, and then there's the really alarming increase in laws against LGBTQ people, especially ones targeting transgender youth.
It's like every time it feels like we take a couple steps forward, something pulls us back again. Just when you think we're making progress, you remember this fight for equality. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's a good way to put it, a marathon. And it's a marathon that crosses paths with so many other movements for social justice. Like the source on food justice, it shines a light on how bad food insecurity is, especially for marginalized communities, including LGBTQ people.
It's just really sad to think that people in our own communities have to struggle with something as basic as being able to afford food. That source taught me about these food deserts, which are places where it's really hard to find fresh, healthy food that you can afford.
And a lot of times, these food deserts are in low-income areas, and those areas often have a lot of people of color, LGBTQ individuals, and other groups who are already facing a lot of challenges.
So we're not just talking about individual people making bad choices. We're talking about a whole system that makes it almost impossible for entire communities to have the healthy food they need.
Yeah, you got it. And a lot of times, those barriers, they come from the same systems we've been talking about this whole time. Poverty, racial segregation, lack of transportation, not enough job opportunities. It always comes back to this idea of everything being connected, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, you can't talk about food justice without talking about racial justice, economic justice, all these systemic things that cause these disparities and keep them going.
And we can't have these conversations without facing the reality of the criminal justice system. Criminal justice reform makes a strong case that it's deeply flawed and needs a major overhaul.
It's just mind-blowing that the U.S. has more people in prison than anywhere else in the world. That's a crazy statistic. It's like we've built a system that's more about locking people up than actually dealing with the reasons why people commit crimes in the first place.
Yeah, it's a system that's been shaped over decades by policy choices, like, for example, the war on drugs, that have really unfairly targeted communities of color.
And it's not just about who ends up in prison. It's about what happens to them once they're there. There aren't enough programs to help them turn their lives around. Solitary confinement is used way too much. There's systemic abuse. It's like we're setting them up to fail.
You've hit on something really important, the lack of focus on rehabilitation and getting people back into society. This source, criminal justice reform, it argues that the way our system is set up now, it actually makes inequality worse, making it even tougher for people to get back on their feet after they're released from prison.
It's like a never-ending cycle. It's honestly a lot to take in, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by how big these problems are. So where do we even start trying to untangle this web of social injustice?
You're right. It's not like we can fix everything overnight by ourselves. The main thing these sources stress is that knowledge is the first step towards making a real difference. Understanding the history behind these problems, seeing the systemic factors involved, and acknowledging the real-life experiences of the people who are most affected, that's how we start to dismantle these systems that are holding people back.
But if you just have knowledge and don't do anything about it, it's like having a car without an engine, right? It looks good, but it's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So how do we take what we know and turn it into real action?
That's where inclusive freedom becomes more than just an idea. It becomes a call to action. It reminds us that each and every one of us has a part to play in building a more just and equal society. And that action, it can take many different forms.
Okay, so what are some examples? Like, what can someone listening right now actually do to make a difference?
Well, one thing they can do is support the organizations and initiatives that are out there on the front lines of these issues.
And now it's up to our listeners to take that knowledge and use it to support causes they're passionate about.
Exactly. Maybe it's donating to a local food bank, volunteering at a center for LGBTQ youth, or contacting your elected officials to tell them you want to see policy changes. Every little bit helps. Every single action, even if it seems small, contributes to the bigger movement for social justice.
It's all about finding your lane, using your voice to help the people who've been silenced or ignored for too long. And sometimes it starts with having those hard conversations, the ones with your friends and family that make you want to disappear.
Yeah, those conversations, as much as we don't want to have them sometimes, they're often the most important ones. They challenge us to look at our own biases, to actually listen to each other, and to talk in a way that's respectful, the kind of talk that can open people's minds and hearts. Speaking of language, a few of these sources talked about how powerful words can be, how they can shake the way we see things. They can either make systems of oppression worse, or they can help dismantle them.
Yeah, it's like that saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But we all know words do hurt. They have the power to hurt you, to make you feel excluded, to make you feel less than human.
They do. And on the flip side, words also have this amazing ability to lift people up, to empower them, to create a world that's more inclusive and just. That's why we got to be careful about the words we choose. We need to challenge stereotypes and generalizations and use language that acknowledges the inherent dignity and worth of every single person.
So much of it comes down to empathy, doesn't it? Putting yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to see the world the way they see it, understanding how your words and actions affect them.
Empathy is huge, but it's also important to remember that just because you understand what someone's going through doesn't mean you've lived their experience. It's about listening with humility, respecting boundaries, and if you have a platform or any kind of privilege, using it to amplify the voices of those who haven't had that chance.
It's about being an ally, working together for justice.
Exactly. And that brings us back around to inclusive freedom. It's not some wishy-washy idea, it's a reality we're all trying to create.
It's about making a world where everyone, no matter their race, religion, who they love, how they identify, rich or poor, any of it, has the chance to live with dignity, with opportunity, and yes, with freedom.
Yeah.
But to make that happen, we have to dismantle the systems that create and maintain these injustices in the first place.
And to dismantle those systems, we have to recognize that all these issues are connected. We can't address racial justice without addressing economic justice. We can't talk about LGBTQ rights without talking about healthcare disparities. We can't ignore the links between climate change and environmental racism. It's all connected, all part of the same fight for a fairer, more just world.
It's kind of like that game, that pick-up sticks game we used to play as kids. You pull out one stick, and it creates this chain reaction that affects all the other sticks.
That's a great analogy. It's about realizing that our struggles are all connected, and when we work together, we're always stronger than we are alone. And this brings us to something that a lot of these sources highlighted, the importance of intersectionality.
Intersectionality, remind me what that is again.
Oh, yeah. So intersectionality is a way of understanding how different parts of a person's identity, like their race, gender, class, sexual orientation, ability, all of those things, they don't just exist separately, they intersect and overlap. And those intersections create completely unique experiences of privilege and oppression.
So it's not enough to just focus on one issue at a time. It's about seeing how all these issues connect and how they can make things even worse for some people.
Exactly. Like, let's say you have a Black transgender woman, right? She might experience discrimination not just because she's Black and not just because she's transgender, but because of the unique way those identities come together. Her experience is going to be totally different from a white transgender woman or from a Black cisgender woman.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
We have to remember that everyone's experiences are complicated, they have a lot of different layers, and there's no one solution that's going to fix everything for everyone.
That's it. That's why it's so crucial to listen to the voices and experiences of those who are the most marginalized, the ones who are most affected. And we have to recognize that those are very often the same people who are leading the movement for change.
It's about making sure their voices are heard, supporting their leadership, and being willing to follow their lead.
Exactly. All these movements for social justice, they were built by countless individuals and communities who've been fighting for generations. It's on us to honor their legacy by continuing the work they started.
And by supporting the next generation of leaders who are carrying the torch.
Yes, that's right. The fight for social justice, it's like a relay race. We each have our part to run, and when it's our turn, we need to pass the baton, and we need to do it with purpose, with urgency, with a real dedication to making the world better for everyone who comes after us.
Well said. And that takes us right back to the core of this deep dive. Inclusive freedom.
It's this idea, this concept that pushes us to imagine a world where everyone has the chance to thrive, to achieve their full potential, and to live a life without fear, discrimination, or oppression.
It's a powerful vision. And if we work together with empathy and courage and this belief in the power of collective action, I think we can achieve it.
I do too. And remember, knowing things is important, but it's what we do with that knowledge that truly matters.
So don't just sit there. The time for action is now.
It really is.
Yeah.
You know, it's a system that's been shaped over decades. Things like the war on drugs, policy choices that have really unfairly targeted communities of color.
Yeah. And it's not even just about like who goes to prison. It's what happens to them once they're actually in there.
Yeah.
Right? Like the lack of programs, to help them actually rehabilitate, the overuse of solitary confinement, the abuse that's built into the system. It's like we're almost setting them up to fail from the get-go.
You're hitting on something really important there, that lack of focus on actually helping people become productive members of society again, on rehabilitation, on reintegration. That source criminal justice reform, it argues that the way our system works right now, it often just makes things worse. It makes it even harder for these individuals to turn their lives around after they get out.
Yeah, it's just a vicious cycle. And it's tough, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed when you start thinking about how big all these problems are. So I don't know, where do we even begin? How do we even start to untangle this whole mess, this web of social injustice?
You're right. It can feel overwhelming. It's not about any one person fixing everything overnight, right? Mm-hmm. But the thing that these sources emphasize over and over is that knowing, understanding, that's the first step to making any real meaningful change. When we understand the history, when we see the systemic things that are at play, when we acknowledge what people are actually going through, what they're experiencing, that's when we can start to dismantle these systems that are holding so many people back.
But knowing something and then not doing anything, that's like having a car with no engine, right? Looks nice, but it ain't going anywhere.
Yeah.
So how do we take all this knowledge, all this understanding, and actually turn it into action?
That's where inclusive freedom, this idea we've been talking about, it becomes more than just a nice thought. It becomes a call to action. It reminds us that we all, every single one of us, has a role to play in making a society that's truly just, truly equitable. And that action, well, it can look like a lot of different things.
Okay, so give me an example. What can someone listening to this right now, what can they do to actually make a difference?
Well, one thing they can do is support the people and groups who are already out there doing the work, the ones who are on the front lines of these issues.
And now it's up to our listeners to use that knowledge to support the causes that speak to them, the ones they really care about.
You got it. Maybe they feel called to donate to a local food bank. Maybe they want to volunteer at a center for LGBTQ youth. Or maybe they want to get more political, contact their representatives, and demand policy changes. Every little bit helps, Every single action, even if it seems small, it all adds up. It all contributes to this larger movement towards social justice.
It's like finding your lane, right? Figuring out where you fit in and using your voice to amplify the voices of those who've been silenced, the ones who've been ignored for far too long. And sometimes that means doing the uncomfortable thing, having those tough conversations, the ones with your friends, your family that make you want to crawl under a rock.
Yeah, those conversations, as much as we might want to avoid them, they're often the most important ones we can have. They force us to look at our own biases, to really listen to what other people are saying, to have those respectful dialogues that can really open people's minds and hearts. And speaking of words, several of these sources really highlighted how powerful language is, how the words we use can actually shape our reality, how they can either reinforce those systems of oppression or help tear them down.
It's funny, you think about the old saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But we all know that's not really true, right? Words can hurt. They can cut deep. They can make you feel excluded, less than, dehumanized even.
They can. But they can also do the opposite, right? They can uplift, they can empower, they can be tools for creating a world that's truly inclusive and just. That's why it's so important to really be mindful of the words that we choose, to call out those harmful stereotypes, those generalizations, to use language that recognizes the inherent dignity and worth of every single human being.
I think a lot of it comes down to empathy, right? Like actually trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to see the world from their perspective, understanding what you say, what you do, how it impacts other people.
Empathy is essential, but and this is important, just because we can understand what someone's going through, it doesn't mean we've lived that experience ourselves. It's about being humble, about respecting boundaries, and if we're lucky enough to have a platform, some kind of privilege, to use that to amplify the voices of those who haven't had that same opportunity.
It's about being a true ally, right?
Yeah.
Standing with and for those who are fighting for justice.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this idea of inclusive freedom. It's not just some pie-in-the-sky concept. It's about creating a reality where everyone can thrive.
Yeah, it's about building a world where no matter who you are, your race, your religion, who you love, your gender identity, how much money you have, any of it doesn't matter. Everyone has the chance to live with dignity, with opportunity, and with freedom. But to get there, we have to tear down the things that are holding back, those systems that create and perpetuate these injustices.
And to do that, we have to understand that these issues, they're not separate. They're all connected. Talking about racial justice means talking about economic justice. Defending LGBTQ rights means addressing healthcare disparities. Fighting climate change has to include fighting environmental racism. They're all intertwined, all part of the same struggle for a more just and equitable world.
It's like, remember that game Pick Up Sticks? Pick up one stick and it sets off this whole chain reaction. All the other sticks start moving.
Exactly. It's recognizing that our struggles, they're connected. And when we join together, when we unite, we're always stronger than when we're divided. And, that actually connects to something that came up a lot in these sources, this idea of intersectionality.
Intersectionality. Okay, remind me what that is again.
Yeah, so intersectionality is a way of understanding how all the different aspects of a person's identity, like their race, their gender, their class, their sexual orientation, if they have a disability, all of those things, they don't just exist separately, they all intersect, they overlap. And those intersections, they create unique experiences of both privilege and oppression.
So what you're saying is, it's not enough to just focus on one issue at a time. We have to see the bigger picture, right? We have to understand how these things connect, how, for some people, they're dealing with multiple forms of oppression at the same time.
Exactly. Let me give you an example. Imagine a Black transgender woman, right? She might experience discrimination not only because she's Black, not only because she's transgender, but because the specific way those identities come together. Her reality, her lived experience is going to be totally different from a white transgender woman or a Black cisgender woman. It's about recognizing the complexity of people's lives, the multiple layers of identity.
That makes sense. It's a good reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Everyone's experiences are different.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to make sure that we're listening to the right voices,
Yeah.
We need to listen to the experiences of those who are the most marginalized, the ones who are most directly affected by these systems of oppression, because a lot of times those are the same folks who are leading the way, showing us the path forward.
Yeah, it's about amplifying those voices, supporting those leaders, recognizing their expertise, and honestly, being willing to follow their lead.
Absolutely. Every one of these movements for social justice, they were built by the tireless efforts of so many individuals, so many communities who have been fighting these fights for generations. We owe it to them to honor their legacies, to continue the work that they started.
And to support the next generation that's coming up, the ones who are going to be carrying that torch forward.
That's it. You got it. It's like a relay race, this fight for social justice. We each have our leg to run, and when it's our turn, we got to run hard. We got to pass that baton with intention, with a sense of urgency, with this deep commitment to building a better world for everyone who comes after us.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Oh.
Well said. And that kind of brings us full circle back to that idea that we started with, inclusive freedom.
It's a powerful idea, isn't it? It's this vision of a world where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential, to live a life free from fear, from discrimination, from oppression.
It is a powerful vision. And you know what? I think if we all do our part, if we lead with empathy, with courage, if we truly believe in the power of collective action, I really believe we can get there.
I believe that too. And let's not forget, knowledge is important, but it's what we do with it that counts. We have to put what we know into action.
So get out there, folks. The time for action is now.
Yeah, it really makes you think about all these movements, all these people fighting for change, like coming together as this powerful force. But with all these deeply rooted problems, these systems that have been around for so long, it's hard to know where it even start to actually make a real difference.
Yeah, it really is. And that's where this idea of inclusive freedom, it can feel kind of overwhelming and also really inspiring at the same time. Overwhelming, of course, because the problems are huge, but inspiring because it reminds us that everything we do, every little thing, every action we take, it can create change. It can have a ripple effect.
So it's like we're not supposed to be waiting around for someone to come along with this perfect solution. We each got to do what we can, right? With whatever resources we have, wherever we are. Exactly. And one of the most powerful things we can do is to really focus on those points of intersectionality that we were just talking about. Remember that analogy of the pickup sticks?
Right.
When we focus our energy on those places where all these forms of injustice, they kind of come crashing together, that's where we have the most potential to create a ripple effect, to create change that's bigger than any single issue.
Okay, so can you give me an example of what that might actually look like in real life?
Absolutely. Let's think about food justice, something that you mentioned really resonated with you. So instead of just addressing the immediate need, which is of course incredibly important, things like donating to food banks, we can also look at the bigger picture, the systemic reasons why these food deserts exist in the first place.
So it's about thinking long term, right? Not just providing food, but trying to fix the system that creates food insecurity. But what does that actually look like? How do we do that?
Well, for starters, we can support policies that make it easier for grocery stores to open in these underserved communities, or advocate for better public transportation so people can get to grocery stores outside of their immediate neighborhoods. We can even support things like urban gardening initiatives, give people the tools and the resources to grow their own fresh produce.
So by addressing those root problems, the poverty, the lack of access, the transportation issues, we're tackling all these different forms of injustice at the same time.
Exactly. See, that's the power of intersectionality. It helps us see how all these things are connected. And it allows us to come up with solutions that can actually address multiple problems at once. The fight for social justice, it's not about putting these issues into neat little boxes, right? It's about recognizing that it's all connected. It's all fluid.
And it's about recognizing that each of us has something unique to offer.
Yeah.
It's not about comparing ourselves to others or feeling like we have to do it all.
You got it. What really matters is that we show up, right? However we can, in whatever way feels right for us, and that we use our voices, our actions, to try and build a world that's more just, more equitable.
And maybe that means being willing to get uncomfortable sometimes, being willing to have those tough conversations, to challenge our own assumptions, and to just, to always be learning, to always be growing.
Absolutely. The path to what we're calling inclusive freedom, it's paved with those uncomfortable conversations, with self-reflection, with this willingness to dismantle systems of oppression, even when we benefit from them.
Because, when it comes down to it, none of us are truly free until all of us are free.
That's it. That's the heart of inclusive freedom.
Yeah.
It's about collective liberation, understanding that our destinies are tied together, right? The only way we achieve true justice is if we stand together in solidarity.
This deep dive has been quite a journey, We started by digging into these historical injustices, and now here we are talking about intersectionality. And it's all been through this lens of inclusive freedom.
It really has. And hopefully along the way, we've given you, the listener, some things to think about, some tools, some inspiration to go out there and take action. Because, knowledge without action, it's like a seed that's never planted. It has all this potential, but nothing will grow.
So let this deep dive be that spark, that little push you need to start your own journey, to be a part of building a world that is more just and more equitable for everyone.
A world where inclusive freedom isn't just something we talk about, but something we actually create, something we live.